The cabin was supposed to be worthless. $100. That's all anyone wanted for it, a broken, rotting structure buried so deep in the mountains that even the deer seemed to avoid it. No electricity. No running water. No neighbors for 12 miles in any direction. Just dead wood, cracked walls, and a silence so thick it pressed against your chest like a hand. Nobody wanted it. Nobody went near it. So when a retired Navy SEAL named Jack Mercer pulled up in a beat-up truck, handed over a folded $100 bill, and started unloading gear with a massive white German shepherd at his side, the town of Calloway Ridge thought he had lost his mind. They laughed. They really did. They stood outside Randy's auto shop and they laughed out loud and said somebody should check on that veteran because something was clearly wrong with him. But Jack didn't laugh back. He just looked at the mountain, looked at his dog, and started walking. 3 nights later, the worst blizzard in 30 years hit those mountains. And Ghost, that big white dog, suddenly stopped moving in the snow. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was completely still, staring down at something buried beneath the drifting white. Jack thought it was debris at first. A fallen branch. Maybe a rock. But when he dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands, he felt something that made his entire body go cold, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. A human arm. Still warm. Someone was alive under there. Barely. And what Jack discovered in the next few hours would unravel a secret that put every single person in that mountain town in danger. There are places in this world that seem to exist just outside the reach of everything. Outside cell towers and coffee shops and the kind of noise that follows modern life like a shadow. Places where the wind doesn't just blow, it speaks. Where the trees grow so dense and so tall that even on a bright afternoon the ground beneath them stays dark. The Calloway Range in northern Montana was one of those places. It sat in the crease between 2 mountain ridges like something the earth had folded away on purpose, a valley cut off from the rest of the state by 60 miles of winding 2-lane road that iced over every October and didn't fully thaw until May. The town of Calloway Ridge itself, population 412, according to the hand-painted sign at the edge of town that someone had stopped bothering to update sometime around 2009, was the kind of town where everybody knew your name before you'd introduced yourself, where the diner on Main Street had been serving the same breakfast menu for 31 years, and where a stranger pulling through in a vehicle that wasn't from the county was enough to get people standing up from their bar stools to look out the window. It was a proud town, in its way. A stubborn town. The kind of place where the people had watched the rest of the world rush forward and quietly decided they didn't want to follow. And for the most part, that suited everybody just fine. So when a dark green pickup truck came rolling down Route 9 on the second Tuesday of November, tires crunching through the thin layer of early snow that had dusted the road overnight, pulling a small utility trailer stacked with gear and supply crates and what looked like enough rope to lasso a mountain, the town of Calloway Ridge noticed. They always noticed. Jack Mercer was 44 years old, and he carried those years the way old timber carries the weather. You could see it in him if you looked close enough, in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes and the way he moved through the world like a man who had already decided exactly how much space he was going to take up and wasn't going to apologize for any of it. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, with hands that were rough in the way that only comes from real work, and a face that had been tanned and then burned and then tanned again by years of sun in places that most people only ever read about. He had short dark hair going silver at the temples, a jawline that could have been carved from the same granite as the mountains around him, and a pair of pale gray eyes that had a quality to them that was hard to describe but impossible to ignore, the quality of someone who had looked at very difficult things for a very long time and had decided, somewhere along the way, not to flinch. 16 years in the United States Navy, 12 of those as a SEAL. 3 deployments to Afghanistan. 2 to Iraq. 1 classified mission that he had never spoken about to anyone, and never would. He had come home from the last of it with a medical discharge, a folder full of commendations that he kept in a shoebox under his bed, and a silence inside him that had taken 2 full years to get used to. Not a sad silence, exactly. Not a broken one. More like the silence that settles over a battlefield after everything has been decided, vast and final and strangely peaceful, once you stopped fighting it. sitting in the passenger seat of his truck, ears up, head slightly tilted, watching the town of Calloway Ridge scroll past the window with the calm curiosity of someone who had seen stranger things than a small mountain town and found most of them interesting, was Ghost. The dog was enormous, a white German shepherd, 93 pounds of muscle and instinct, and an intelligence so sharp it sometimes made Jack feel like he was the one being evaluated. Ghost had been Jack's partner for 6 years, originally trained as a military working dog before being paired with Jack during his final deployment, and the two of them had developed the kind of bond that people who have never worked alongside an animal in a dangerous situation find hard to fully understand. It wasn't a pet and owner thing. It wasn't even really a friendship, though it was that too. It was more like a mutual agreement, built on trust that had been tested under circumstances where the cost of getting it wrong was everything. Ghost knew Jack's moods before Jack knew them himself. He knew the difference between the quiet that meant rest and the quiet that meant something was wrong. He could read terrain the way a trained soldier reads a room. And he was, in Jack's honest estimation, the finest partner he had ever worked with, human or otherwise. They had been driving for 3 days, coming west and north from Tennessee, where Jack had spent the last 8 months in a rented house outside Nashville trying to figure out what he was supposed to do next. He had done the therapy. He had done the transition programs. He had sat in the circles and filled out the worksheets and talked about his feelings with the kind of earnest effort that he brought to everything, and he had come out the other side of all of it with a genuine respect for the people who ran those programs and a growing certainty that what he actually needed wasn't in any city, wasn't in any suburb, wasn't anywhere that smelled like traffic and takeout food and other people's anxiety. What he needed was space. Specifically, he needed the kind of space that pushed back against you, the kind that demanded your full attention and your full capability, the kind that didn't care about your rank or your record or how many classified operations you'd survived, the kind that just sat there, enormous and indifferent, and waited to see what you were made of. He had found the listing on an obscure county property auction website at 2 in the morning in late October, when he was sitting at his kitchen table in Nashville with a cup of coffee and Ghost asleep at his feet, and the kind of restlessness crawling under his skin that had been waking him up at odd hours for months. Parcel 7 of the Calloway County Rural Land Register. Structure present. Condition unknown. No utilities. No road access beyond the main forest trail. Minimum bid, $100. He had stared at it for a long time. Then he had looked at Ghost, who had raised his head from the floor and looked back at him with those steady amber eyes, and something about the way the dog held his gaze felt like confirmation of something Jack hadn't quite been able to put into words. He had placed the bid that night. He had won the following morning. And 3 weeks later, here he was. He pulled the truck to a stop in front of the only gas station in Calloway Ridge, a weathered 2-pump operation with a hand-lettered sign reading Randy's Fuel and Auto over the door, and climbed out into the cold. The temperature was in the low 20s, a dry, biting cold that came down off the mountain peaks with an efficiency that didn't mess around, and Jack's breath fogged in front of him as he stretched out the stiffness of 3 days of driving and looked around at the town. It wasn't unpleasant. There was something honest about it. The way the buildings sat close together against the cold, the way the sidewalks were narrow and practical, the way the whole place had the look of somewhere that had never bothered to perform itself for tourists or outsiders because it simply didn't need to. Ghost jumped down from the truck and stood beside him, surveying the street with the composed alertness that was his default mode in any new environment. A few people on the sidewalk paused to look at the dog. Ghost was, by any measure, an impressive animal to encounter without warning. That much white fur, that much muscle, those amber eyes that tracked everything with a precision that went well beyond what people expected from a dog. 2 children outside the diner across the street stopped dead and stared with their mouths open, which was, in Jack's experience, the most natural response in the world. The door to the gas station swung open and a man came out, wiping his hands on a rag that might once have been a useful color but had long since been absorbed entirely into its own filth. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, with a wide red face and small, bright eyes that were set a little too close together, and had the permanently amused look of someone who had made a hobby out of finding other people's decisions ridiculous. Randy Cook had been running this gas station since his father handed it over to him in 1998, and in that time he had become, without anyone exactly appointing him to the role, the primary voice of local opinion in Calloway Ridge. Not because he was the smartest or the most experienced, but because he was the loudest, and because he had a gift for packaging his observations into the kind of short, cutting comment that stuck in people's minds and spread through the town like weather. He looked at Jack, then at Ghost, then at the trailer behind the truck, and his face arranged itself into an expression that was 1 part curiosity and 2 parts the beginning of a very good joke. "You the one that bought the Hartley parcel?" he said, not as a question. Jack looked at him. "That's right," he said. Randy let out a short sound that was technically a laugh, but functioned more like a verdict. "Son," he said, "I have sold a lot of gasoline to a lot of people passing through this town, and I have never once sold any of it to someone I'd call smart for buying that property." He grinned, pleased with himself. "That cabin's been abandoned for 20 years. Roof's mostly gone. You got no power, no water, no access once the snow gets above 3 feet, which in this valley happens about every other week between November and April." He looked at Ghost again. "Nice dog though," he added, as a sort of consolation. Jack reached into the truck for his credit card. "I'll take a fill-up," he said. Word, as it always does in small towns, traveled fast. By the time Jack had finished at the gas station and driven the 2 miles to the Calloway Ridge Public Library to pick up the trail maps he had requested, people along Main Street already knew who he was and what he'd bought. The librarian, a small, thin woman in her late 60s named Martha Hale, with silver hair pinned up in a way that managed to be both practical and elegant, and warm brown eyes behind a pair of round glasses that she wore on a beaded chain around her neck, was the first person in Calloway Ridge to greet Jack without any trace of mockery. She had the maps already laid out on the reference table when he walked in, and she smiled at him with a genuine, uncomplicated warmth that was so different from Randy's reception that it landed like a hand on the shoulder. "You must be Mr. Mercer," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Martha. I found you the best trail maps we have, plus the county topographic survey from 2018, which will show you the drainage patterns up on that ridge. Important to know when the snowmelt comes in spring." Jack shook her hand. "That's exactly what I needed," he said, and meant it. Martha looked at Ghost, who was sitting at Jack's side with the perfectly composed posture of a dog who understood that libraries were quiet places and had decided to honor that. "What a beautiful animal," she said softly, and Ghost, without moving his body, raised his amber eyes to look at her, which from Ghost was as warm a greeting as he typically offered strangers. Martha smiled. "He looks like he's been places," she said. Jack glanced down at the dog. "He has," he said. Over the next 20 minutes, while Jack studied the maps, Martha, without being intrusive, without being nosy, with the quiet and skillful generosity of someone who had spent 40 years of her life giving people exactly the information they needed without making them feel surveilled, told him what she knew about the Hartley parcel. The cabin had been built in 1961 by a man named Elias Hartley, a former forest ranger who had retired up into the mountains and lived there alone for 22 years before his daughter had finally convinced him to come down to the valley in his 80s. Nobody had owned it since, or wanted to. The access trail was usable by truck in late summer and early fall, but once the heavy snow came, and it always came, the only way in or out was on foot or snowshoe. The nearest neighbor in any direction was a sheep farmer named Dale Bruck, and Dale's property was a 40-minute walk through forest on a good day. "People think it's strange that you bought it," Martha said, folding her hands on the table, speaking plainly but without malice. "They'll say things. Randy, especially. Don't take it too personally. People up here aren't unkind, they're just cautious about things they don't understand." Jack rolled up the topographic map and tucked it under his arm. "I'm used to it," he said. And he smiled at her, a real smile, quiet and unhurried, and Martha thought to herself that whatever had brought this man up here into these mountains, it wasn't weakness. The trail to the Hartley parcel wound north from the edge of town through a corridor of old-growth spruce and pine that thickened as it climbed, the trees pressing in on either side of the narrow track until the sky was reduced to a thin stripe of white above, and the sound of the town dissolved entirely into the huge, muffled quiet of the forest. Jack drove slowly, the truck rocking over exposed roots and frozen ruts in the path. Ghost standing up in the passenger seat now with his nose pressed to the crack of the window he'd left open, drinking in the cold forest air with a concentration that was somewhere between joy and analysis. They emerged from the tree line into a small clearing on the north-facing slope of the ridge, and Jack put the truck in park and sat for a moment, looking at the cabin. He had seen the listing photos, but listing photos lie in both directions. They can make a ruin look like a charming fixer-upper, or they can fail to capture the thing that actually makes a place matter. The Hartley cabin was neither worse nor better than the photos had suggested. It was a simple, square structure, maybe 800 square feet, built from timber that had been substantial once and had weathered into a deep, silver gray that was almost beautiful in the flat winter light. The roof had indeed partially collapsed on the eastern side. A section of old shingles and rotted beams had come down, opening a ragged gap to the sky. The windows were intact, miraculously, though clouded with decades of grime. The front door hung slightly open, the latch long since rusted through, and through it Jack could see the gray light of the interior and the scattered debris of 20 years of abandonment, leaves and small branches blown in by seasons of wind, a collapsed shelf, the ghost of an old wood stove standing in the corner like a patient monument. Around the cabin, the clearing was maybe 100 feet across before it met the tree line again on 3 sides, and behind the cabin the ground rose steeply up the ridge, covered in deep snow between the trees. Jack sat there for a long moment, looking at all of it. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when something confirmed what he'd already decided. He looked at Ghost. Ghost was already looking at him. "Home," Jack said. And he opened the door. The first week was hard in the uncomplicated way that real physical work is hard. The kind of hard that doesn't require you to feel anything in particular, just to keep moving. Jack set up a canvas tarp over the collapsed section of roof on the first afternoon, lashing it down with a thoroughness that would have held it against most things the sky was likely to throw at it. He sealed the gaps in the walls with expanding foam and sheet metal where the timber had split and shrunk. He rebuilt the door latch with hardware he'd brought in the trailer, planed the swollen frame back to square, and hung it so it closed clean and tight against the cold. He swept 20 years of forest debris from the floor, inspected the old wood stove and found it structurally sound, cleared its chimney with a brush kit, and by the third morning had a fire going that turned the interior of the cabin from a gray, penetrating cold into something genuinely warm. The wood stove was an old Vogelsang model, cast iron, heavy as a philosophy, and once it got going properly it threw heat with an almost aggressive generosity that made the small space feel welcoming in a way that Jack hadn't expected. He found himself sitting in front of it that first night with a mug of coffee and Ghost stretched out on the braided rug he'd brought from the trailer, and for the first time in a long time, a genuinely long time, he felt still. Not numb. Not resigned. Still, in the way that a compass needle is still when it has finally found true north. Over the days that followed, he installed a diesel generator in a small outbuilding he reinforced against the weather, running a cable to the cabin to provide minimal electrical power. Enough for lights, for the radio equipment he'd brought, for the medical gear he kept in a pelican case under the table. He erected a radio antenna on the roof, a compact but effective HF unit that could reach both the county emergency frequency and, with the right equipment, a good deal farther. He organized the interior with the economical precision of someone trained to operate in environments where every item needed to be exactly where you expected it and immediately accessible. Medical supplies here, tools there, food stores in the driest corner, communications gear on the shelf beside the door. He dug a cold storage pit behind the cabin and lined it with stones against the permafrost. He mapped the clearing and the immediate tree line in his notebook, marking distances, angles, the places where the terrain provided natural cover or natural funnel points. He did all of this automatically, without drama, the way someone might make coffee in the morning, because it was simply what you did when you set up a position, and old habits of thinking don't vanish just because the context changes. The people of Calloway Ridge, predictably, had opinions about all of this. Randy, who had apparently driven out to the trailhead with a couple of friends on the second day, ostensibly to check whether the truck had made it through the deep rut at the 3/4-mile mark, had reported back to the town that the new guy was building himself a bunker up there. No kidding, I swear he had radio antennas going up, looked like something out of one of those doomsday shows. This traveled through the diner and the bar and the post office with the frictionless speed of small-town news, gathering commentary as it went. Someone said they'd heard he'd been discharged for psychological reasons, which wasn't true but sounded true in the telling. Someone else said he had a dog up there the size of a horse, which was almost true. A man named Carl Briggs, who was the town's self-appointed authority on most things and an actual authority on almost none of them, delivered a considered assessment over coffee at the diner that the cabin was going to collapse on the veteran before Christmas, and it would serve him right for buying property without a proper inspection. Only Martha, when the conversation found its way into the library, said quietly that she thought Jack Mercer seemed like a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and that people ought to let him do it. Nobody argued with Martha, they never did, but nobody really listened either. Ghost, through all of it, was doing something that Jack was noticing but not yet troubling himself to interpret. The dog, who was professionally trained to a level of behavioral discipline that most people never see in an animal, had always been excellent at settling when there was nothing to do. Lying flat and quiet, conserving energy, the way soldiers learn to sleep anywhere and eat when you can and rest without guilt when rest is available. But in the clearing of the Hartley cabin, Ghost was not settling. He was watching. Specifically, he was watching the tree line on the north side of the clearing, the direction where the ridge climbed up into serious alpine territory, rock faces and old-growth timber and elevation that made the satellite maps go blurry. Every evening, as the light in the clearing shifted from the flat gray of winter afternoon to the blue dark of early mountain night, Ghost would go to the north side and stand there, still as a statue, those amber eyes moving methodically across the tree line with a focus that was unmistakably professional. He wasn't reacting to deer or rabbits. Jack knew what that looked like in the dog, the slight quickening, the different quality of attention. This was something else. This was the kind of attention Ghost had used, in other places and other times, when something was wrong in a way that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. On the fourth day, Jack found the tracks. He had been doing a perimeter survey of the clearing as part of his morning routine, moving methodically around the edges, reading the overnight snow the way the forest reads it. Who or what had moved through since dark, in what direction, at what pace. Most of it was ordinary. Deer at the south tree line, a fox that had circled the cold storage pit with interest and apparently decided against it, the small spaced prints of something he thought was a marten along the cabin's east wall. But on the north side of the clearing, in the band of shadow just inside the tree line where the overnight snow had partially filled the tracks but not completely, he found something else. Boot prints. Large, military-style tread, he thought, though the partial fill made it hard to be certain. 2 sets, maybe 3. It was difficult to separate them where they overlapped in the compressed snow beneath the spruce branches. They came out of the trees from the northeast, crossed a section of open ground near the clearing's north edge, and then turned back into the trees heading west. No hesitation in the stride. No circling, no apparent stopping. Whatever had made these prints had been moving with purpose, through this clearing, at some point in the last 24 hours, and had not stopped to investigate the cabin. Jack crouched over them for a long time, studying them with the careful attention he'd once applied to reading terrain in places where reading it wrong meant not coming home. Then he stood up, looked at Ghost, who was sitting 3 feet away watching him with the expression of an animal who had been trying to tell him something for several days and was cautiously pleased that it had finally registered. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He had no way of knowing yet who had made those tracks, or why, or where they were going, and he was a careful enough thinker not to build theories on incomplete evidence. But he returned to the cabin that afternoon and checked his radio equipment with a thoroughness that hadn't been strictly necessary before, and he moved the Pelican case with the medical supplies to a position that was more accessible, and he loaded the Sig Sauer that he kept in the lockbox under the bunk and put it on the shelf beside the radio. Not because he was afraid. Because it was what you did when the information changed. The storm, when it came the way all truly serious storms come. Not all at once, but with an accumulating inevitability that the mountains themselves seemed to feel before the sky gave any indication of it. Jack noticed the pressure change on the 5th day, a subtle but distinct shift in the quality of the air, the way sound traveled differently across the clearing, the way the light went from its usual flat gray to something slightly yellower, slightly heavier, in the middle of the afternoon. Ghost noticed it too, or something related to it, because the dog's posture shifted over the course of the afternoon in a way that Jack recognized from deployments, a gradual, almost imperceptible tightening, as if every muscle in the animal were slowly being brought online. The sky was still clear at 4 in the afternoon, pale blue above the peaks and hard with cold, but the clouds were building to the northwest in a formation that moved with the heavy, deliberate slowness of something large and very much in earnest. By 8 that evening, when Jack sat down to eat and the fire in the wood stove was going full, the wind had picked up enough to be audible through the cabin walls. Not howling yet, not the full voice of it, but getting there. He had checked the weather on the radio 3 days ago and noted the forecast, a significant low-pressure system moving in from the Canadian Rockies, estimated arrival within the week. He had laid in supplies, topped off the generator, double-checked the tarp on the roof. He was ready, as he was ready for most things, in the quiet and thorough way of a man who had survived enough unpredictable situations to understand that readiness is not a guarantee, but it is the only responsible choice. By midnight, the storm was no longer accumulating. It had arrived. The wind came first, driving hard from the northwest across the ridge, and within an hour it was above 50 miles per hour, pressing against the cabin walls with the groaning authority of a force that did not particularly care what was in its way. The temperature, which had been in the low 20s before the storm, dropped another 20 degrees in the space of 90 minutes, and the snow that came with the wind was not the gentle, vertical snow of a quiet winter night. It was horizontal, pelting, driven with a force that turned every flake into a small projectile and reduced visibility outside to near zero within minutes. Jack sat in front of the wood stove with his coffee and his radio, tracking the storm on the county emergency frequency with the unhurried concentration of someone who takes the weather as seriously as any other form of intelligence. Power had failed in the valley below. He could hear the county dispatcher coordinating responses, the voices of emergency workers carrying that particular tone of professional calm that means things are genuinely serious. Up here, the generator was holding, the roof was holding, the fire was holding. Ghost was pacing. That was the thing that Jack couldn't put into a routine framework. Ghost did not pace. In 12 years of working together, through situations that would have reduced most human beings to their most basic level of barely controlled fear, Ghost had never paced. He moved when there was a reason to move, and he was still when there wasn't, and there was never any anxiety in the movement, only information. But now, in the storm, the dog was moving from the door to the north wall and back again. Not frantic, not loud, but persistent, with a quality of attention that Jack had only seen in him a handful of times, and every one of those times it had meant something important. Jack watched him for a while. Then he put down his coffee, put on his thermal layers, his storm jacket, his gloves. He picked up the flashlight, not the small tactical one, the big high-lumen model with the wide beam, the kind that actually cut through driven snow, and he looked at Ghost. Ghost was already at the door. The cold outside was not like ordinary cold. It was the kind of cold that the mountains reserve for their most serious moments. Total, physical, something that gets into the space between your layers and your skin in the first 30 seconds and tells you in completely unambiguous terms that your body is not designed for this and that every second you spend here is a negotiation. The wind hit him broadside the moment he cleared the door frame, nearly taking him off balance, and the driven snow reduced his flashlight beam to a diffuse glow that showed him maybe 15 feet ahead at best. Ghost went ahead into it without hesitation, moving north across the clearing in a straight line, his white coat making him almost invisible in the snow except for the amber glow of his eyes when he paused and looked back to make sure Jack was following. Jack followed. He moved carefully, the way you move when you can't see well and the ground under you might be anything, keeping his weight centered, placing his feet deliberately, his free hand ready to catch himself. The snow was above his boots now, at least 18 inches in the open clearing, deeper in the drifts that had built up against the tree line. By the time he reached the north edge of the clearing, he had been outside for 4 minutes and could no longer feel his fingers properly even through the gloves. Ghost had stopped. He was standing at the base of a large spruce at the clearing's edge, in a drift that had built up against the root system and the low branches to a depth Jack estimated at nearly 3 feet. The dog was not barking. He was not moving. He was standing with all 4 feet planted in the snow, his head dropped slightly, his attention fixed on a specific point in the drift with the absolute, motionless concentration of an animal who has found something and is waiting for a human to catch up. Jack came up beside him and crouched, directing the flashlight beam at the point where the dog's gaze was fixed. In the sweeping light, through the driven snow, he saw what looked like a depression in the surface of the drift, a slight irregularity, a place where the mounding of the snow had a different shape than the wind would have made it. It could have been anything. A fallen branch. A rock. A piece of the debris that blew through these clearings. He pulled off his right glove, feeling the cold slam into his bare hand like a physical blow, and pressed his fingers into the depression. He felt fabric. He pushed deeper. He felt something solid, curved, human in its contour. He shoved the glove back on, got both hands into the snow, and started digging. And when his fingers closed, 6 inches down through packed white ice and snow, around something unmistakably the shape of a human forearm, he felt his heart do something in his chest that was not fear and was not surprise but was the absolute, crystalline clarity that had always come to him when a situation became completely real. He dug faster. And out of the snow, inch by inch, emerged the shape of a man, dressed in military-grade cold-weather gear, face down, completely motionless, the cold-weather jacket on his back dusted with a layer of ice that told Jack he had been there for a while, long enough for the storm to have begun to make him part of the landscape. Jack pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck, found the carotid, and felt something that made everything else in the world go quiet. A pulse, faint and slow and irregular, but there. Alive. Barely. Jack looked up at Ghost, who was still standing there, still watching, with the focused patience of an animal who had been trying to tell him something for 3 days and was now waiting to see what he was going to do about it. Jack didn't think. That was the thing about real training, the kind that goes deep enough to become instinct. It removes the pause between situation and response so completely that by the time your conscious mind catches up, your hands are already working. He got the man upright, pulling him out of the drift with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that every second the body stayed in contact with frozen ground was a second the core temperature dropped further toward the point where it stops coming back. The officer was heavy, solid, military-built, probably 190 pounds before the soaked gear added its weight, and he was entirely limp, his head falling back against Jack's shoulder like the head of a man who had given everything he had. Jack got him into a fireman's carry, adjusted the weight across his shoulders, straightened, found his footing in the deep snow, and started moving. Ghost went ahead, breaking trail where the drifts were deepest, the dog's broad chest pushing through packed snow to open a slightly easier path. The wind hit them from the left, driving snow horizontally in sheets that took the flashlight beam apart before it got 10 feet, and Jack moved with his head down, counting steps, keeping his eyes on the amber glow of Ghost's eyes when the dog paused and looked back. Ghost stopped once at the midpoint of the clearing, and for a single terrible second Jack thought the dog had paused for a reason. Some new threat in the dark trees, but Ghost just looked back at him and kept moving, and Jack followed. The cold had gotten all the way inside his jacket now, past the thermal layers, settling against his skin with a patient hostility that told him exactly how close to the edge of this they all were. He reached the cabin door, shouldered it open, and brought the man inside. The warmth of the wood stove hit him like a wall, and for a moment Jack let himself feel it, let the heat work against the cold that had gotten into him, and then he was moving again, getting the officer down onto the floor beside the stove with the care of someone placing something irreplaceable. He stripped the wet outer layers with practiced speed, checking as he went, arms, legs, torso, neck, the systematic survey of a man trained in tactical combat casualty care who had performed this assessment in places where getting it right or wrong meant whether someone's family got a phone call. No obvious injuries. No entry wounds, no exit wounds. Whatever had put this man in the snow wasn't a bullet. What Jack could find was the evidence of someone who had been out in extreme cold for a very long time. The skin of the hands and forearms was a deep mottled red going toward white at the fingertips, the early markers of frostbite. The face was waxy, the lips colorless, and the breathing was shallow and ragged, the lungs working with the heavy reluctance of machinery asked to operate past its limits. But the pulse was still there, weak, slow, irregular, but there. Jack pulled the 3 emergency blankets from the Pelican case, heavy-grade mylar, and wrapped the officer in them, tucking the edges in, creating as complete a thermal envelope as the materials allowed. He put heat packs inside the first layer at the core and at the back of the neck, fed the fire until it was as hot as the stove would safely run, pulled his chair close, and sat down to watch and wait the way you watch and wait when there is nothing more you can do but stay present and refuse to leave. It was during this waiting that Jack noticed the gear. He had set the man's outer kit aside when he stripped the wet layers, and now it sat against the wall beside the door. A tactical load-bearing vest, soaked through but still carrying its contents. Jack went to it, moving with the deliberateness of someone who understood that what you find in a man's kit tells you something important about why he is here. The first thing he found was the radio. It was tucked into the left chest pocket of the vest, and it was not the kind of radio a hunter or hiker carries. It was a compact encrypted tactical unit, military grade, the kind not available outside specific federal and intelligence agency channels. The encryption seal on the keypad was intact. The device was the kind of thing that, in Jack's experience, only ever showed up in the field when the stakes were high enough to justify the chain of custody it required, which meant the stakes here were exactly that high. Jack turned it over in his hands and set it on the table without powering it on. The second thing he found was the badge. It was in a hard plastic case inside the vest's inside pocket, the protective housing of something considered important enough to protect from operational rough handling. Jack opened it and looked at the badge for a long, steady moment. It was a federal agent's credential, the design and format unmistakable to anyone who had worked alongside federal agencies in joint operations, which Jack had done more times than he could count. The name on the credential was Daniel Reeves. The issuing agency was one whose name Jack recognized immediately, and whose involvement in a place as remote as the Calloway Range told him, with complete clarity, that whatever was happening on this mountain was not local and was not small. The third thing he found was the notebook. A small, water-resistant field notebook tucked into a zippered inner pocket of the vest. Jack pulled it out and opened it, and what he found made something in his chest go very quiet and very alert at the same moment. Most of the pages were filled with encrypted notations or shorthand he couldn't parse without a key, grids, abbreviations, coordinates reduced to a format deliberately unreadable to anyone without the cipher. But on the last written page, water-stained and smeared where moisture had gotten past the cover, there was something different. In handwriting that showed the irregular pressure of someone writing in haste or in pain, there were GPS coordinates, 8 of them, in 2 columns, and beside them, written not in ink but in something darker and more visceral that Jack recognized without hesitation as dried blood, a single line, "They know. Get this out." He stared at those 3 words for a long time. He looked at the radio. He looked at the badge. He looked at the man wrapped in silver blankets beside the fire, and he thought about the boot tracks in the snow, and Ghost watching the tree line every night for 5 days, and the way the dog had led him directly to this man in a zero-visibility blizzard. And he thought, with the methodical clarity that training builds in a person, about what all of those things together meant. He was still thinking about it when the officer moved. Not dramatically, no gasping, no sudden sitting up. It was slow and effortful, the way a person surfaces from very deep water. The man's eyes opened and drifted without focusing, his first breath deep and rough and seeming to cause him pain. Jack moved his chair closer and waited without speaking, giving the man space to come back in his own time. Gradually the eyes found Jack's face, and in them Jack saw the sequence he recognized from other men in other hard situations. The confusion, the reassessment of surroundings, the painful return of memory, and then the alertness of someone who, even in an extremely compromised state, had not forgotten they were in danger. The man's lips moved. Jack leaned in. The voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked with cold, but the words were precise and deliberate, shaped with the effort of someone spending the last of a specific reserve to say the one thing that most needed to be said. "Don't trust," the officer, Daniel Reeves, said, pulling breath. "Anyone. In the valley." His eyes held Jack's with a directness that had nothing diluted in it, even now, even like this. And then they closed, and his breathing steadied into something deeper and more regular, and Jack looked at the fire and understood, with the full weight of experience and instinct, that whatever mission had brought this federal agent to the Calloway Range and left him buried under 3 feet of snow with coordinates written in his own blood was not over. Not by a long way. The vehicles arrived before dawn. Jack heard them before he saw them, sound traveling further than light in the storm, the low growl of heavy engines in terrain that did not want to be driven. He heard them to the northwest first, somewhere above the cabin on the ridge, then a second set from the east, moving through the trees. He went to the window without turning on any additional light, keeping clear of the glass, and in the sweep of a powerful handheld spotlight, he saw two men in dark cold weather gear moving through the tree line in a pattern that was not the pattern of men who were lost or looking for a missing hiker. It was a sweep pattern, methodical, coordinated, the two moving parallel and offset to cover maximum ground with minimum exposure. They were not wearing law enforcement identifiers. They had no rescue markings. One was carrying a suppressed weapon slung across his chest. Jack watched for a measured 30 seconds, cataloging positions, movement speed, direction, spacing, and the location of a third vehicle sound on the south side of the clearing. 3 vectors. At minimum 3 men. They were good. They were organized. And they had no idea, not yet, that they had found what they were looking for. Ghost was at his side without being called, standing pressed against Jack's leg with all the stillness and coiled readiness of an animal who has been in this situation before. Jack moved back from the window, checked on Reeves, still unconscious, breathing steadily, and then went to the shelf and picked up the Sig Sauer. He checked the load, seated it. He keyed the county emergency frequency and spoke quietly and precisely, the way he always spoke when information was important and time was limited. He gave his location. He gave the name Daniel Reeves and the agency. He reported an injured federal agent and armed individuals conducting what appeared to be a hostile search of the surrounding terrain. He requested law enforcement and federal response as fast as conditions allowed. The dispatcher acknowledged, and Jack set the radio on the table and began to do what he had been trained, over 16 years and more situations than he cared to catalog, to do. He prepared to hold a position. He moved through the small interior with the economy of genuine expertise. Not panic, but the calm efficiency of someone executing a checklist they have run many times in their head. He killed the interior light, leaving only the low glow of the wood stove. For a moment the cabin felt like exactly what it was. A small human thing held against the vast dark and cold of the mountain, deliberate and fragile and, in this particular moment, necessary. He repositioned supply crates to create a barrier along the north wall. He identified the angles, the windows, the door, the gap where the tarp joined the east wall. He was not afraid. He had been afraid before, in real places against real odds, and he knew what it felt like. That particular way it sharpened the senses and narrowed the world to the present tense, and he was grateful, genuinely grateful, for the training that had taught him to work with it rather than against it. What he felt now was something he might have called purpose, the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are most equipped to do, at the moment when it matters most. Ghost alerted at the door 7 minutes later. Not with a bark, because he knew from the quality of the silence Jack was projecting that this was a quiet situation. What he did was freeze, all 4 feet planted, every muscle going from relaxed alertness to total engagement in the space of 1 second, his eyes fixed on the gap under the door with an intensity as clear as a spoken word. Footsteps in the snow outside, moving with the careful slowness of someone trying not to be heard. Jack positioned himself to the right of the doorframe, not in front of it, but beside it, where he could engage anyone who came through before they had a chance to orient, and waited with the absolute stillness that 16 years of operating in tight spaces had built into him at a cellular level. The door handle moved. The door cracked open and cold rushed in along with the sound of the storm and a sliver of dark outside. A gloved hand appeared around the frame. And then Ghost moved. 93 pounds of white German Shepherd launched from 6 feet away, covering the distance in less than a second, and the scream from outside, short, involuntary, genuinely shocked, was followed immediately by the heavy sound of a person going down into the snow. Jack was through the door before the echo cleared, and the second man, his weapon rising, found himself looking at the end of Jack's Sig at 4 feet, and found in Jack Mercer's gray eyes above it absolutely nothing that suggested this was going to resolve in his favor. "On the ground," Jack said, very quietly. The man went to the ground. Ghost held the first man with a controlled grip and the professional patience of an animal who will release on command and not a moment before. The third man, coming from the south side of the cabin, stopped at the corner, heard the first scream, assessed the situation, and raised his hands. They were zip-tied and secured inside the structure they had come to search 30 minutes before the first flashing lights appeared at the edge of the tree line. The county sheriff's vehicles came first, chains on the tires, pushing through the drifts with the grinding determination of law enforcement told that someone is in danger and who decided the road conditions were someone else's problem. Behind them came the federal response. 2 black SUVs carrying 4 agents in tactical gear who moved up the trail with the precise energy of people relieved and grim in equal measure to have finally confirmed a location. They found Jack sitting at the table with a radio in his hand, and Ghost beside him, and 3 secured men against the wall, and a federal officer wrapped in emergency blankets by the wood stove, breathing steadily, color returning to his face with the slow and determined progress of a body that has decided, against considerable odds, to stay. The lead federal agent, a woman named Torres, who carried the weathered authority of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, looked at all of it, then at Jack, then at Ghost. "Is he alive?" Jack said. "Yes." Torres let out a long breath. "Good." And for just a moment, behind the professionalism and carefully maintained composure of a federal officer who had been running a very bad scenario for 72 hours, something crossed her face that was simply human relief. She looked around the cabin, the organized supplies, the reinforced walls, the antenna, the barriers Jack had positioned, and said quietly, "Who are you?" Jack set the radio down. He looked at Ghost, who looked back with those amber eyes that held, as always, the calm certainty of an animal who had done exactly what he came to do. "Nobody special," Jack said. In the weeks that followed, as the storm cleared and the mountain opened back up, the story came out in pieces, some through official channels, some through the particular intelligence network of a small mountain town, where information travels through conversation the way water travels through rock. Daniel Reeves was a senior federal agent who had been conducting a covert investigation into a network using the remote mountain corridor above Calloway Ridge as a transit route for deeply illegal and dangerous materials, and his cover had been broken 3 days before the storm, which was why he had been running alone through mountains in weather that should have killed him and nearly had. The men who came to the cabin that night were enough to have finished it if they had reached him. They were in federal custody by morning. Reeves spent 4 days in a Missoula hospital being treated for severe hypothermia and frostbite that cost him 2 fingertips on his right hand, but nothing more. He sent Jack a letter 3 pages long that Jack read once and then folded and put in the shoebox under his bunk with the commendations, because it said things he did not know how to receive out loud but recognized, in the quiet of himself, as true. The shoebox, Jack thought as he slid it back under the bunk, had room for one more thing. The town of Calloway Ridge took the story the way small towns take stories that puncture their assumptions, slowly at first, with uncomfortable silence, then all at once, with the full-throated warmth of people who know they got something wrong and are determined to get it right. Randy Cook was the first to drive out to the cabin, not with his easy superiority from the first day, but with a 6-pack of decent beer and the quiet of a man who has been a fool and knows it. He sat with Jack on the cabin step and said, after a long silence, "I was wrong about you." Jack opened a beer and handed it to him. "You didn't know me," he said. "Nobody starts out knowing anybody." Randy sat with that, nodded, and they drank in the kind of companionable quiet that is, in its way, more generous than most words. Martha Hale organized the community response with the efficiency of someone who had been organizing things in this town for 40 years. The food that arrived over the following 2 weeks was extraordinary. The kind of cooking people do when they are putting something of themselves into it, when the act of making it is an apology and a welcome all at once. Jack accepted all of it because he understood that people need the chance to make things right, and that giving them that chance is its own kind of generosity. It was Martha who proposed the sign, the town council that approved it unanimously, and a man named Pete Harlow who made it in his woodshop over 3 evenings and installed it at the turnoff to the Hartley Trail. It read, Mercer Ridge, Storm Rescue Point, and below that, in honor of Jack Mercer and Ghost, and the date of the storm. When Jack drove past it for the first time, he slowed to a stop and sat looking at it with the engine running and Ghost in the passenger seat. The dog looked at it too, then looked at Jack, and Jack looked back at him for a long moment. He thought about 16 years of service in places where nobody built signs for the things you did because the things you did happened in the dark and stayed there, and that was the deal you made when you signed up, and he had never regretted it. He thought about a $100 cabin and a broken roof and the stillness he had felt that first night with the wood stove going and Ghost asleep on the rug, that stillness that had felt, after everything, like something he had been looking for a long time without knowing what he was looking for. He thought about Daniel Reeves, who would carry those 2 missing fingertips as a quiet souvenir of how close it had come. He thought about Ghost in the blizzard, standing patient and certain, waiting for Jack to catch up with what he already knew. And then the snow began to fall, softly this time, in the vertical and unhurried way of snow that is not trying to prove anything, settling on the sign and the road and the roof of the truck and the trees. And Jack put the truck in gear and drove up the trail toward home with Ghost's nose at the cracked window and the whole mountain quiet and white around them, and the only sound was the soft press of tires through fresh snow and the low idle of the engine. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.